Mahone,
Here.
Kasuga, Erickson,
Here.
Fu,
Here.
Horn,
Here.
Jones, Phillips.
Here.
Quorum established.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. When last we met, we were talking about agenda item number 10. We'd had some public comment. We'd had a presentation by Dr. Matt Turner on the EPPP, the enhanced EPPP. And before we go further, Dr. Horn?
Thank you. I'm going to recuse myself from this part of the meeting because I work for ASPPB, the organization that is creating the enhanced EPPP.
See you later. Okay, so we did have a presentation by Dr. Turner. We had some discussion. Mr. Fu gave the report out on the EPPP task force, and now we are going to go back on the record. Okay, this is an opportunity for there to be public comment on this on the question of item number 10. So. If anyone would like to speak to the EPPP2, we'd be happy to hear their comments. And we would ask that you make sure to use the microphone because we are webcasting this. So you just need to push the center of the microphone and you get a green light.
That works. Okay. Dr. Paul Marseille, I'm the president this year of the California Psychological Association, and I'm also a professor at Palo Alto University in the Pacific Graduate School of Psychology, one of the clinical psychology training institutes in California. And just the task force report was discussed yesterday. Okay, all right. Well, then I won't repeat what was in the report. And thank you very much, Seiran, because I also was on the task force, and the report accurately reflected our discussion and some of the concerns and reservations that many of us had in the training institutes. So I think I'm probably just going to reiterate that we have some concerns that this modification of the EPPP is going to put a burden and a prejudice on graduate students who are attempting to become licensed psychologists and may prove a barrier to students of limited resources. Some of the comments about moving the first part of the test during the training cycle, during school, closer to classes, I think was well received by some of us in the sense that it would test for knowledge that's taught in courses. I found particularly problematic a comment that the test fees could be covered in student loans, which many of our students take out, only because our students are graduating with exorbitant amounts of student loans, making it difficult for them to start their careers. There are changes occurring at the federal level in terms of the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. Looks like the student loan programs are going to be modified, limiting the amount of loans that graduate students can take out, and adding additional costs and delays in students starting their careers, we think is very problematic. Most of our students now are graduating with over $250,000, $300,000 in student loans, those coming out of private schools, and anything that delays the start of their careers, allowing them to start reimbursing and paying those things back are problematic, and can lead to a lack of competitiveness in the marketplace for psychologists getting jobs. And we also see that this is a burden and a potential barrier for producing more psychologists to serve populations that aren't currently being served. So that's a reservation. And then some of us attended meetings at the American Psychological Association conference that was held in San Francisco this last weekend. And I attended several meetings where discussions about the EPPP exam were occurring. And many of us who work in the training programs have similar concerns, the concerns that I've expressed. And concerns that a test of competency at the end of the training cycle is not necessarily going to screen or weed out not students, but psychologists who have ethical violations or derelictions in their duty later in their careers when these things tend to occur. And some of us have considered that possibly more training, more rigid CE requirements. We have an ethics requirement, but maybe that needs to be extended. But that a test of competency at the end of the training cycle is not necessarily going to screen these things out. So I think we all understand the burden of having to deal with potentially creating another test if we're not able to, if this is going to roll out. But we don't think, I think as was reported by the task force report, that this is a benefit to consumers or that it's going to help the profession at all. So that's my comment. Okay.
Thank you very much. How many other people want to give public comment on the subject of the EPPP2? Okay, none. So we are going to need to discuss as a board what we're going to do relative to the EPPP. One of the issues that we have not discussed so far involves the fact that were we to choose, as Dr. Marcel said, to take a different route and to develop our own test. And I think to some extent this was highlighted in the task force materials. We would have a problem with license mobility, which is a consideration for a lot of licensees. In other words, if you hadn't taken the same test as people in other states took, then they're not going to necessarily recognize the California license as equivalent to their own license, in which case, if someone wanted to geographically relocate or to get a second license or a third license or fourth license, they'd have a very difficult time doing so, which presents us obviously with a lot of practical dilemmas as it relates to the idea of not going with the EPPP2. But I'd be curious to hear what other board members have to say on the subject of the EPPP2 in general. Oh, the rush for the microphone.
I was just. Oh, yes. Why the cost is so high for the exam? That's what I was.
So from the presentation that we heard from Dr. Turner, the cost is a reflection of the research and investment in resources in the development of the exam, and hence the doubling of the cost. The task force did ask Dr. Turner, which he did relay back to the ASPPB board, that because the EPPP Part 1 has been in existence for much of time already, and that development initial startup cost is no longer there, if they would consider lowering the cost of the EPPP Part 1 to bring down the overall cost. It is to our understanding in a board letter back to us from ASPPB that no decision had been made at the time and that they would explore the option, but there was no commitment made in terms of lowering the cost. And I do know that at a recent meeting that we had on Monday, the outgoing CEO of the ASPPB board had indicated that in his remarks that they do a lot of other things with the examination revenue to support their members. And while it wasn't explicit, I just, from my own reading, interpretation, if you will, it didn't sound like that was going that way. But we're not sure yet until they let us know.
So it is a possibility that the cost might be. I hear what you're saying about.
I think it's speculation at this point until further notice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
They had it under active consideration, from what I understand. We actually went, Mr. Fu and myself and Ms. Sorick. There was a board of directors meeting for ASPPB in San Francisco, so we were there on Monday and discussed with them the concerns that had been raised by the task force, and then some more general concerns as to the organization itself. But they're very receptive to what we had to say. And I think we really raised, as Mr. Fu's report indicated yesterday, we raised the three primary issues, I think, that came out of the discussion with the EPPP task force. It's kind of affordability. It's a question of timing. And when I say timing, it's really timing in two different ways. One is timing as to implementation of the test. What ASPPB has said to date is that if you do not license the second part of the test, you'll no longer be able to administer the first part of the test, that it comes as a package because it's a competency and skills-based or knowledge and skills-based instrument. So they're not going to allow you to use it unless you take both. So we brought up cost. We brought up, given the fact that they're rolling this test out, they're not rolling it out till, I think, what they're expecting right now is the beginning of 2020. We explained to them about the regulatory process here in California and the delays that might be attendant to going through regulatory change. The third thing we talked to them about was the actual timing of when somebody could take the test, because we have a state where there are a number. One of the distinctions ASPPB made was that you could only take the exam early if you had completed your coursework in an APA approved program or an APA accredited program. In California, we have a large number of programs that are not APA accredited. They might be regionally accredited or otherwise accredited, and we felt that put people at a real disadvantage, and we were not comfortable with that. Now, that third issue is really up to us in terms of what we do in regulation. We just wanted to make them aware of it. But those first two issues, which we brought to them, there was an indication that they were considering them and they were going to get back to us with some kind of response as it related to those first two issues.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Yesterday, in your report, Mr. Fu, you mentioned that the task force had concluded, I think that's the right term, that perhaps ASPPB had overreached in terms of their responsibility or direction or efforts to have each of the state boards implement this. And I'm not sure, is there more that will be discussed or some resolution of that concern? From that perspective, it certainly feels like this package may not be entirely wanted by all boards, or I'm not even sure about our board yet. The timing of it, the cost of it, more involvement from the state boards. Do you have a way of refreshing us on where we might think that would go from here?
I think currently, based on, it seems like we are not the only board that has expressed concerns about how it's been rolled out. I think, I believe New York, Louisiana, and the state of Washington have been particularly vocal about it. And I think those concerns, and Dr. Stevens did, Dr. Phillips, did convey that sentiment as well on Monday at their open board meeting about our concerns related to what is the role that they occupy as a membership association, which we belong to. And so certainly they are, and they did release a letter just, I think, 2 days ago now, indicating that they have heard feedback from several boards, and that's why they're pending a potential notice to all of us sometime next week related to any changes with relation to the EPPP Part 2. So I think that's where we are currently. Is that a fair reflection, Dr. Stevens? Dr. Phillips?
Yes, it is. So I think we're waiting to see what the response is, but we're also in the position where we need to make at least a preliminary decision as it relates to the EPPP2, because whatever dates they give us, we know what our regulatory process is like, that there are multiple layers of review in our regulatory process. So I think there's been discussions, a variety of discussions as to how to do that and leave pending. the question of these two issues?
I know from my perspective, having sat on the task force and now in this in today's role, I certainly would like to see what the ASPPB decides to relay to us in terms of the concerns we've raised, and I think that information will be coming to us sometime next week. And so I think if we were to go down the route of potentially going forward, I think it should be contingent only on the of what they share with us next week, particularly as it relates to the cost and to the implementation piece for us. I think that's where it makes logical sense in terms of an informed decision, is to make it contingent upon whether our concerns have been addressed.
So would you like to propose a motion along those lines?
For discussion purposes, or?
Well, it's always for discussion purposes, but is there something specific you have in mind?
I think I just want to lay that out as a discussion point, and as we continue to deliberate and to hear back.
Well, at some point it might be appropriate to have a motion so that we have something on the floor that we're actually discussing, but happy to entertain further discussion.
It seems there's a number of pieces or factors that go into looking at this. Could you give us an idea of a couple of possible routes that we might consider as a way of a motion? I'm not suggesting that you necessarily, I'm not asking if you would make a motion, but to give us an idea of where we might consider like A, B, or C, and we have this unknown coming next week. Or
well, what I was thinking was, and I thought this was the lines you were talking along, Mr. Fu, but maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm wrong. Is that we should make a motion to move ahead with the EPPP2 contingent on whatever response we receive, subject to whatever response we receive as to the questions of as to implementation date and as to cost. I think those are the two that really we have some reasonable expectation of perhaps impacting ASPPB with regard to. I think that allows us to continue to address the concerns that have been raised by various stakeholders relative to the test. At the same time, it allows us to continue to move forward because we still need to figure out if we're going to do it, assuming the board wants to move ahead with it, then we're going to have to figure out what or in what manner we would implement it, including what would be the date that people would first be able to take the test and what would be the criteria for doing so. Because the wheels grind so slowly sometimes in terms of our process, I think it's better for us to at least move partway down that road. We could always decide to head back out again. The problem we have is, certainly California state government has the capacity to develop a standalone test, but it is going to put us back in the same position that California has been in historically relative to other states that license psychologists, and that is we're looked at it with a slightly jaundiced eye. I thought we were kind of getting past that, but if we were to use our own examination, we become a totally different creature than in other states. And I strongly suspect that the majority of jurisdictions are going to adopt the EPPP2. So I have a real serious concern about license mobility and our capacity to kind of keep our licensees on an equal playing field with licensees in other states. So there's countervailing considerations, I guess.
a quick, if I could, the approved versus accredited issue, would that be part of the timing, or is that a separate issue? It seems like an important one that we wouldn't want to have our potential licensees disadvantaged if they had not gone to an APA accredited.
Well, I think part of the argument was for getting, asking approved institutions to get regional accreditation in the most recent legislative move, was so that psychology graduate education was more standardized in California by use of these accrediting agencies. It has been, as sore points, probably overstating it. But it has been one thing that other states have looked at and said is very different in California than in other states. So sometimes it's been difficult for some jurisdictions to know how to approach our license. I don't think that means people didn't get reciprocity of licensing. But that was what I was referring to as the issues that seem to be going kind of becoming more and more in the rearview mirror. I think if we decide to develop our own test, I think it's going to be potentially problematic.
Dr. Phillips, to clarify, the contingency piece, would it be then to bring it back to the board in November if what we hear back from ASPPB doesn't address the concerns that we raised? Would that be the intention of that contingency piece, that if we hear back next week that they aren't delaying the 2020, for example, or if they're continuing with the 1200 without a cost reduction mechanism, that the board would then be able to reconsider this item in November or at a future board meeting?
Well, we can always reconsider a prior action, but I think to be clear about what we're doing, I think it would be important to say that we're still waiting for responses on these two issues, and we may decide to go in a different direction depending on what the responses to those issues are. So I think it's to say, let's move ahead, but we will revisit the issue once we have the response back from ASPPB. Does that make sense? Anyone like to make a motion? Oh, Ms. Marks?
I just want to be clear that if moving ahead requires the staff to engage in any particular actions, that once the responses come from ASPPB, that they know what to do after that, based on what the motion is.
Good point.
May I ask a question to Ms. Sork? Ms. Sork, in terms of what Ms. Marks just raised, what would be the staff action required so that we could clarify in our motion as it relates to hearing back those responses?
I'm going to kind of lean to our esteemed legal counsel on this, but I think it may be more helpful if the motion were articulated such that Mr. Fu, you had suggested, where if the board decided to move forward, that it would be contingent upon ASPPB addressing the cost issue and the implementation date issue, such that, and I don't know if you have to somehow define what address means, but if it's lowering the cost and pushing the date out to 3 years, which would be a reasonable time frame for us to adopt regulations, that would be, I think from my perspective, a little bit of a clearer line. And if those two issues are not addressed, then they would automatically come back to the board in November for a full discussion on potential alternatives. But that's just a throw out there.
I guess to me the potential problem with that approach is, though, if we do get responses back, how does staff know if the responses are adequate to the concerns that we've raised? So I'm almost going back to the position, I wonder if we shouldn't just move ahead with a straight motion to adopt the EPPP2 and then know that we're going to deliberate on it further once we have responses. But I think we'd leave staff in a very awkward position, as Ms. Marks might have indicated. But I do think that time is of some concern here, so I guess I'm walking back a little bit.
I am concerned about, I think, the cost issue, and particularly the implementation issue that was raised. And I don't feel that with absent clarity from ASPPB, I think their memorandum out to all the boards kind of threw us off for a loop, that we could move forward without getting clarity on the cost and implementation issue, particularly since on our end, if the 2020 issue isn't resolved, we would be in a situation that we wouldn't be able to move forward because of our regulatory needs and because we want to adopt. And I am concerned about what the 100% increase would do, particularly for when we think about consumer protection in terms of access to psychological services, what that means for students who are seeking to serve their communities and take on that additional debt. One of the things that struck me from the conversation was, I think, Dr. Phillips, you had raised that here in California, CDCR has over 2,000 employed psychologists, or about, in that conversation with the ASPPB board. And one of the board members expressed in response, wow, that is more than the licensees we have in our own state. And that struck me in terms of in terms of the gravity of our situation here in California and the responsibility that we have to represent the concerns of consumers here. And so from my perspective, having clarity on the cost and implementation issue is important before adopting it.
I'm going to make an alternative suggestion, which is I think it might be a good idea if we were to not make a motion today and do a telephonic board meeting once we have a response from ASPPB. So we'll have greater clarity about what we're actually talking about. Because if the responses are unsatisfactory to the board, there'd be no purpose moving ahead with the EPPP2. And given that we've asked for the information, to the extent that it delays the process while we're waiting for them to formulate their response. So perhaps that would be a better direction to go in.
Would and this might be a question to staff in terms of logistics, but would that telephonic, is that the right adjective, convening allow for participation of public comment? Because I think because of the stakeholder approach that I think we as a board has taken on in contrast to perhaps the ASPPB, I certainly will want to make sure that we are able to hear from in that setting and format from different stakeholders.
Have you not done a telephonic board meeting with us yet?
I did a year and a half ago, and I don't, but it could be because the issues we weren't talking about didn't require public comment, or that there weren't folks raising their mics.
The reason I ask is because typically what happens is when we notice the meeting, we also give the telephone number where people can patch into the telephone conference, so that to the extent they have comments to make as we're going through the process, we can solicit public comment, we can get the feedback from members of the public.
Would it be possible to also encourage written submissions? Is that a possibility, so that we can get that as a part of our board packet for that telephonic convening?
Sorry, written submission from ASPPB?
If folks have public comment related to the item, and to submit it in written form to us as well, as long as they meet a certain deadline posting, is that possible?
We could, and we could share that by email to the board members. As long as, we could get it in a timely enough, we wouldn't want to get it 30 minutes before the teleconference and then we don't have access to it and then someone's on the line, and the expectation is that you guys have a copy of it and have read it.
Understood. Okay, never mind. That makes sense.
Question of the task force, is there a plan for a follow-up meeting? It seems the task force has been important to us as a board in terms of informing us as to the issues, and I would think if there's going to be a follow-up meeting, will it be after we hear from ASPPB and prior to the telephonic? I'm curious about that.
My understanding is there's not an immediate plan to have a third task force meeting. We basically did it to get the stakeholders' comments on this. Sometimes I think people, from looking at some of the materials and discussion that got submitted during it, people got confused about what this task force was doing. So some people spoke as if they were determining the issue rather than the board determining the issue. So I don't want to further confuse the stakeholders as to their role, other than to continue to give us feedback relative to what's under consideration, because obviously that's very important. That impacts people's lives. And we are dedicated to the idea, I think, particularly in the wake of our experience with continuing professional development, to engage stakeholders as much as possible around issues like this, to make sure that people feel like they have an opportunity to weigh in early on.
Just a couple things. I just want to be clear that the Open Meetings Act does not require public comment be given in person. It can be given written. It may impact the degree to which the board can consider that comment, but that members of the public can always submit written comments, and sometimes they're read into the record, and sometimes they're just passed out to the board. The other thing I wanted to suggest potentially is that this item is linked to item 16 on the agenda. It may make more sense about what motion you want to make here when you're looking at the specific actions that you may or may not be directing the staff to take in item 16. Because I don't want the board to say, we're not going to make a motion now, we'll wait till November, then get to item 16 and think, well, we can't move on item 16 because we don't have any clear direction in item 10.
Well, I think
so
that's,
maybe
that's actually the way it's intended, is item 16 is contingent on item 10. So I would like to have an opportunity for Mr. Fu to explain to us what the different options that were considered by the task force and which they thought were most desirable. But I don't think we're not going to make any progress on that issue until we've resolved the issue on number 10.
And I guess when we get to item 16, it may or may not. The issues are linked. Whether the actions are linked is a different question. So I just want to leave open the possibility that if the actions are linked, that you come back to item 10 when you're looking at item 16.
Were you suggesting we could have a motion on implementation but not have decided on the actual adoption of the test? Or are you saying, go ahead, do your informational thing now, but you'll have to come back and look at 16 again in reference to your discussion relative to 10?
Well, I think the other way is when you're looking at item 16, which issue-wise is linked to item 10, you may decide when you get to item 16, we can leave item 10 for November and still move forward with item 16.
Okay. That's
or
what I
we
was wondering.
can't, and then we'll revisit
That's
a
what I was
motion
wondering.
item 10.
Okay. That answers it. Thank you. Appreciate it, Ms. Marks. So it looks like the consensus on the board is that we're going to move on without having made a formal motion as it relates to number 10, other than we've resolved that we were going to schedule some kind of telephonic board meeting and to discuss these things further. I'll have snacks at my office. That being the case, before we even start to consider item 16, is there any further public comment on item number 10? How many people would like to make comment on item number 10? One? One person? Only you, Mr. Pugliati? Okay. I'm just trying to figure out in terms of time allocation, if there were a number of people that wanted to make comments, I was going to allocate the time, but since you're the only one that wants to make comment.
I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
Thanks again. Good morning. I'm Renee Pugliati. I'm the Executive Director of CAPIC, the California Psychology Internship Council. Yay. You started this conversation this morning talking about concerns regarding mobility, and then we got talking about, with Dr. Erickson, regarding the concerns that the task force and Mr. Fu talked regarding ASPB taking over some of the regulatory responsibilities from government bodies, which is not really their purview. I want to go back to, so I've got concerns about both of those issues. One is regarding mobility and licensure issues. I mean, we currently have these issues right now. Just last week, I had a student who went through a CAPIC internship who moved to Idaho and was seeking to get licensed by their board. And what I did is simply I contacted the board, gave them information about what we do, what our quality assurance is, how we're organized and the like, and the student was approved as a psychologist in Idaho. So there are pathways for doing this in other states to deal with some of these mobility issues. And I think going forward, we'll still deal with them in various ways. And my other concern is that with So one regarding mobility is that we're going to have these issues regardless, whether we have the EPPP or not have the EPPP, and we've addressed them in the past. We'll continue to address them ourselves, and I'm sure the board will as well. Regarding the issue regarding ASPPBs overstepping its bounds in terms of entering the regulatory field, and where they don't have we don't have any ability to really control what they do. They've already done that in the fact that they're going to be requiring that to take the EPPP 1, we're going to have to be from an APA accredited school in order to do it directly through them. So they're already usurping some of your rights and without any accountability at this point. Go ahead, Dr. Fu. I thought you were going to. I'm very much concerned about it, and I think that for many licensing boards, especially for the smaller states, EPPP will make their life easier. I think in California, it would probably make our lives easier as well on some level, but I'm concerned about not just in terms of protection of the public, which I'm not seeing really the evidence of. I'm also concerned about the access of care to the public by this EPPP 2 restricting psychologists being able to enter the profession, and not just people of color or low income, but of people with different theoretical orientations that are oftentimes trained at regionally accredited schools and not always APA accredited schools. And then related to that is I am concerned about ASPPB and its relationship with APA. I think that they're intertwined quite deeply on many levels, and one evidence of that is they are recognizing students who attended APA accredited schools, but they're not recognizing students from PC-SAS accredited schools, which is also a national accreditation system that's recognized by the Department of Education. And PC-SAS stands for Psychological Clinical Science Accreditation System. And UC Berkeley and UCLA psychology programs both are PC-SAS accredited programs. There's about, right now, a little over a dozen throughout the states. These PC-SAS accredited programs are also APA accredited, but the reason why they're existing is because, among other things, they're not happy with APA accreditation, and while they're currently dual accredited, at some point they may break off and only become PC-SAS accredited. So it's evidence of my concerns regarding ASPPB's one having control of our licensing requirements without our ability to really impact or have authority over them, and two, their intertwined relationship with APA, which is both a professional organization as well as an accrediting arm. So those are my basic concerns.
Okay, if I could, and partially this is from what came out of our meeting with ASPPB earlier this week. So, in all fairness to them,
sure,
I do want to respond to some things. I think there's a big difference between getting your hours approved for an internship and not taking the same licensing exam. So, for instance, the licensing exam in California is dictated by statute, correct? Yeah. Which test we've adopted is dictated by statute. So they may not have the same flexibility they have on approving hours as they would to approve not taking a particular test. So they're kind of different in terms of the magnitude of the issue.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. In terms of how the discussion goes, I think, among regulatory boards. The second thing is we've raised both those issues, actually, that you had mentioned. One being, is ASPPB the boss, or are they a membership association for psychology boards, and the psychology boards ultimately drive the ship? You have the same, as a member of some psychological associations, sometimes you have the same question, but decisions need to be made by associations. Actually, as they have pointed out to us on more than one occasion, this all went through the member jurisdictions at their conventions and conferences for a period of years. So it's not like the boards didn't know what ASPPB was up to and they sprang this on us. I will agree. I would advocate that ASPPB did a very awkward job of rolling out this examination and really educating people about it before they just sprung it on people, even though it had been in discussion in the regulatory community, and to a certain extent, we as a board had tried to make you aware of the EPPP2 in advance of even the availability or the future availability of the test. they did have kind of the charge from the majority of jurisdictions to go ahead and develop this test. So it's not like they kind of went rogue and just came up with this idea on their own. The other thing is, and this was their response, and their response to the question of their relationship with APA is it's very hard if you're going to be in the discussion about regulation at the level of kind of the national level without having a seat at the table at things like APA. So that was the response.
That's fair. I've attended the ASPPB meetings for the past 2 years until I was uninvited because I don't meet with their strategic plan. Not me, but KPIC. So having a seat at the table is directly on point to one of my concerns with that. The last thing is that the task force understands that this is the board's responsibility. We just want to make sure that these issues are raised clearly so that you guys can make an informed decision.
And it's unfortunate you couldn't. Were you here yesterday when we had the task force report, weren't you?
I came at the second half of it. I was a little bit late.
I think Mr. Fu did a very fine job of kind of expressing all the misgivings the task force had about the test. And we're well aware of that. So, it's not that the task force's voice has not been heard. It's very much been heard.
I got you. I appreciate it.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, so that is going to conclude item number 10 for the time being. We will be revisiting the subject at a later point in time once we are able to schedule a telephonic meeting. For those of you that are interested in continuing to be involved in this process, you might want to sign up on our listserv for notifications relative to board meetings that you can get regular. I get them all the time. I'm on there twice, actually, somehow, so I keep getting them twice. But you can get notices. It'll show what the agenda is and what we're going to be discussing. So if you want to keep your eye out for that upcoming telephonic board meeting, please feel free to do so. Okay, and then we'll give you instructions on the agenda as to how to phone into that meeting so that you can participate as a member of the public. Dr. Linda Crow?
Dr. Joe Linder Crow, I'm the CEO of the California Psychological Association. I just want to ask a process question. So if you're going to have the telephonic meeting after, this is my understanding, after you receive the letter that Dr. Turner referred to yesterday, will that letter be made available somehow to the public so that before that meeting, will that be part of an agenda for that meeting?
It'd be part of the agenda items that we post
Okay.
online, and they're part of our packet.
It'd be part of the package.
Okay, and what is the requirement for noticing a board meeting? How long in advance?
10 days?
10 days.
10 days, okay.
We try for sooner than that,
Yeah.
but that is the legal requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we try to give advance notice as possible,
Right.
but it's also a question of scheduling all the different board members to be on the telephone
Sure.
at the same time. And
Sure, I just want to just make one other comment about something you said about the task force, because we were represented by Dr. Marcial and several members of our student group. I think what I heard at the task force meeting, the last meeting, was not so much that the task force members felt that they were making a decision, but there was some confusion about what the purpose of the task force was, as you said. And there was confusion, I think, about whether or not the task force was being asked to make a recommendation to the board. And at that meeting, there was a desire to make a motion in order to make a recommendation, and then I think they were told that they couldn't make a motion and make a recommendation. I agree that you did a really good job of covering the broad range of things, but there was some confusion at that last meeting about procedurally how the task force members could make a recommendation to the board based on their discussions at their meetings. And there was some, I'm not sure that I even understood at the time. It was not agendized as an action item. Is that correct, Mr. Fu? There was something like that.
I think my understanding was that the item hadn't been agendized from the April meeting, and I think potentially a lesson taken away from that experience was that if or when then there's another change prompted by another portion of our world requiring a task force, that we do some sort of orientation on Open Meetings Act and how putting agenda items are in place, such that there's a comfort level as we hit the ground running, so that we won't be in a similar situation. So I definitely hear that feedback, and I think I would encourage us to think through potentially as recognizing how difficult it is to bring 15 people together, but some sort of quick orientation the next go around on how to agendize something, and I think I certainly would welcome that since we do have a broad array of stakeholders.
And I would suggest that it's definitely been a staff learning lesson on how to orient a group that are not normally part of a regulatory body on the process, on agendize. When we talk about agendas, items for future meetings, what that means we want to take it back up and want to be able to discuss it and take a vote on it at the next meeting. And therefore, that way the task force can say, yeah, we had this general consensus, but we want this item back on the agenda next time.
Yeah, okay.
So that way it's a little clearer, because I think we did miss that kind of like, let's give you the scope and charge and some meeting protocols at the beginning. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're actually working on guidelines for our task forces at CPA, and so we fully understand that sometimes you can get down the road, and I think that's what happened. The task force members, there was a moment where I think everyone was like, well, then what are we doing here? If we're not going to make a recommendation, then why are we having these discussions? So I appreciate that. That's helpful.
I think the original intention was, and I'm the one that formed the task force, I'm the one to blame, I guess. The original intention behind the task force is we set forth some very specific questions, and we asked we really wanted to know what the concerns were. We didn't need a recommendation necessarily, and maybe that got lost somewhere in the shuffle.
Yeah.
So we'll have to reframe it better next time.
Yeah.
But it was just to find out what people's concerns were, and we kind of used the questions to highlight potential areas of concern.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So I had wanted to continue the discussion on number 10, because obviously it's of concern to a number of people in the state of California. What we have not done is some other items. So I'd like to actually go to item number 12, which is public comment. No, not yet, no. Public comment for items not on the agenda. The board may not discuss or take action on any matter raised during the public comment section except to decide whether to place a matter on the agenda. If there are any public comments as to items for future agendas. Okay, hearing none. I would like to then have the DCA executive update. No, that'd be awkward. So why don't we go to item number 16? You're right. That's a good idea, Ms. Sorek. Sorry, I rejected it initially. So back to the EPPP task force. We will be getting to Ms. Nelson very shortly. But we have a board member that had to recuse themselves, so we want to just finish this discussion so they can join us for the rest of the agenda.
So as discussed yesterday, one of the concerns of the task force related to how ASPPB had allowed, it was moving forward with allowing only APA-accredited students at APA-accredited schools to take the EPPP Part 1 early. And I think that as an overview, the concern was that this would be a disadvantage to the students here in California with regional accreditation, and we will want to make that option available. And I also do want to recognize that we have 3 task force members in the audience, Mr. Pigliati, Dr. Yves Bradbury, and Dr. Marcial. And so the item before us on number 16, and with Ms. Mark's helpful clarification earlier, is so that we could discuss the possibility of making sure that we continue an equal playing field, and also clarify some of our own regulations as it relates to the change at ASPPB. And the main concern was there were several concerns, but one of them was in relation to the fairness here in the state. But secondly, also what would happen to a student who's out of state at an APA accredited school, not in California, who then takes the exam early and then attempts licensure here in the state, what would happen to their application. So I will yield to Ms. Burns to go over the options.
So if you're following along on the agenda, item 16, there are some exam sequences in attachment A. And I'm going to go ahead and go right down to the comparison chart because that's kind of the easier way to look at these. Staff tried to develop a sequencing chart for everyone to see so that it was equally comparable. Option 1 was to make no changes to the board's regulations and statutes, and that would have obviously created this gap between coursework completion and doctoral degree completion where there is a delay in licensure in the process. So this delays students in California, but it would allow APA out-of-staters and then potentially also in-state APA students to take it, but then begs the question of if we hadn't changed our laws and regs, would we accept that EPPP score, and how unfair that would be to ask somebody to do the EPPP again. But also if we accepted it, we were creating inconsistent licensure pathways, and one of our goals is consistency and equity in the licensing process, so that didn't seem like a very viable option with option number 1. Option number 2 is the 2 center columns. And obviously the biggest problem with this one is a significant delay in licensure for non-APA approved program students, and then a significant decrease in the time to licensure for those that are part of an APA program. This on its face was inconsistent and inequitable for students. We did not like this 2 bifurcated process here for licensure for students in California or for even people coming in. And then there was the option 3, which is what staff recommended and the EPPP task force did end up recommending as well for the board, is that if ASPPB continues in this way and the board does decide to continue with EPPP, that we do allow all students, regardless of what program they're from, to do the EPPP 1 pre-course or pre-degree conference, so after coursework is completed. This way, no matter what type of school you went to, as long as you met the requirements of the board, regional accreditation, or others, that they can all take it at the same point in time. It's an equitable system. It would somewhat, by 1 notch, shorten the time to licensure, at least in comparison to the alternative, which would be a significant delay. So, barring any discussion of the fact that there is one additional barrier and additional time to get to licensure, at least this option 3 is the most equitable option for all students. It's also consistent for out-of-state or in-state. This way everyone is treated the same and there aren't any questions of should it count, would it not count, and creating market disadvantages for certain types of students. So option 3 is the one that is recommended by the task force and by staff.
Oh, go ahead.
And to be clear, it's an option, so it's not a requirement that students do take the EPPP Part 1 upon completion of academic coursework. We're just creating the potential pathway for that student if they so choose to move forward at that path. This option does not preclude a student from waiting to go through their entire program, taking the EPPP Part 1, getting their score, and then moving straight into the EPPP Part 2. We are not saying that there's any preferred timing. We just want to make sure, I think, as you said, Ms. Burns, that there's consistency and equity involved, and I think that was the goal there. And the second piece I want to also emphasize from the task force perspective was that this option in itself should not be seen as a tacit approval of the EPPP 2 exam as a whole. So this was a reflection of the task force recognizing the need for consistency and equity, but with also deep reservations about the enhanced EPPP generally speaking. So I just wanted to make sure I clarify that. So,
and we are cognizant, just so that as a recap, we are cognizant of the concerns that some of the academic programs have mentioned that allowing people to take the test that early on potentially will interfere with their academic progress. So there's concern that it may in some ways be contrary to the purpose of education.
Mr. President, was it appropriate to make a motion at this point on this item?
I don't think, and you can correct me if you're wrong, Ms. Marks, can we make a motion contingent on deciding to adopt the test at a later point in time?
What motion are we considering right now? Are we talking about the
If I understand,
regs?
it is if there is to be implementation of the enhanced EPPP, we'll call it just for sake of clarity, the enhanced EPPP, then we would proceed along the lines outlined in option 3
So
as to eligibility.
Okay, so if we're looking at the materials for item 16, you're talking about attachment C, is that right? So you're talking about a motion potentially to approve this language for noticing. Is that what which is option 3?
That was where I was leaning towards, contingent, of course, on whether or not we actually go forward with the EPPP. 2, but given that I think there was a general consensus from the task force that if we were to go with the EPPP, this would be a good option for consistency and equity reasons. But I think, pending what we hear back from ASPPB and the telephonic convening, that if at that time this board decides not to adopt the EPPP Part 2, this wouldn't happen at all. Is that?
Can we just wait until we hear from, just wait until we get more clarity on this, and then all of this option 3 would be included in that?
I would agree with Ms. Akwebudu. I mean, I think there's just so much that we're just not clear on.
I think what I understand Mr. Fu to be saying is that can the board direct staff to move forward with proposed regulatory language, which doesn't necessarily, which at this point would be including the enhanced or requiring the enhanced EPPP, yet subsequent to this, either make any regulatory changes or pull the reg package back. That's what I think Mr. Fu is recommending. Is that what I understand to be?
That's correct.
Okay, so not necessarily. So you can move. So you're saying let's move forward with the regulatory language in recognition of the fact that the process is rather lengthy, yet not necessarily be tying the board's hands to accepting the enhanced EPPP. Is that correct?
Okay. Staff, how would that be helpful for staff to do that?
I want to make sure that works for staff. That is clear then.
I think it would be a staff preference that we be able to get things started and drafted, and we can always pull back, make changes, do whatever we need to do, because the process is very lengthy. And if we have to wait another, month, 3 months, 4 months, it could add a lot more to the process. So I would say we can always make changes, we can always pull packages, we can always stop the process, but it's better to get it started because it's a long one.
Okay. So let me be clear then. So we're just looking at option 3 and the language for option 3? Okay.
And that language, I believe, is attachment C under item 16. Is that right, Ms. Burns?
That's correct.
Okay. So what I think, again, that Mr. Fu is suggesting is to authorize staff to move forward with this, yet it's not a tacit approval of the board acceptance of the enhanced EPPP.
Is that a formal motion, Mr. Fu?
Yes. I would move that the board adopt the recommended language for option 3 and contingent upon the adoption of the EPPP Part 2 exam. Is that the motion?
Well, I think at this point the board can just approve this language for noticing and set for hearing.
What about statutory language?
Well,
Separate motion.
Yeah, separate motion. And I don't know that you need to make this part of the motion, but what I understand it is it's not a tacit approval of the enhanced EPPP.
Let me be clear and go back and we're just dealing with option 3 and the language in that. I just want to be real clear on this.
That's correct.
Okay.
It's the idea that we want to make sure that the students in California would be aligned with whatever is going on outside, of course, without the tacit approval of the EPPP Part 2, and that we can pull it back
When or if
if appropriate.
Okay. Which will give staff time enough to be ahead of the game. Very well. Okay.
So I move to do.
So the
Is there a second for the motion?
I second that motion.
Okay. Is there board discussion relative to that motion? Is there public comment on that motion? Dr. Winkleman?
Oh, okay. Hi, Dr. Elizabeth Winkleman. I'm the Director of Professional Affairs at the California Psychological Association. I wanted to thank the board for appointing the task force and soliciting input from the many stakeholders who are going to be affected by EPPP 2 if that's adopted. I had a question about option 3, and it gets back to the idea of like what's within the board's purview and what's within ASPPB's purview. And I just wanted to get clarification that would the board have the power to set when the EPPP1 can be taken, or could it be possible that ASPPB would take the position we are not going to admit anybody to take the test unless they've come from the APA accredited? I just wanted to get
ASPPB's
clarification.
responded to that. They're not going to try to set the criteria for the state of California.
Oh, great.
That was their
Okay.
suggested criteria for how it would be done. But they're more than happy to have us have our own regulations as it relates to that. They
Great.
weren't trying to usurp our regulatory power in that regard.
Okay, because I also appreciate the idea of having equity among the students and when they're eligible to take the exams. Thank you.
And just so people understand, we do that at present anyway. We dictate by regulation when someone's eligible to take a particular examination because they have to go through an application process in order to be approved to take the examination. Dr. Linda Crow?
Yeah, this is one of those issues about nomenclature, but I know it becomes important when we are trying to explain to people about what ASPPB is suggesting. And I want to be sure that that the way I'm understanding this is the way the board is thinking about it. And that is that it wouldn't be so much a decision to adopt the EPPP2 as it would be a decision to continue to use the EPPP as a criterion for licensure in California. So ASPPB has said that the EPPP will now have 2 parts, and that if you choose to use the EPPP, you must use both parts, right? So I know it's nuanced, but Ms. Burns is going, And, it's important, I think, in the language, because the decision point for the board, it seems, is to make a decision about whether to continue to use the EPPP going forward.
I think for purposes of clarity for us, it's important to think of it in that language. I appreciate you saying that, but also to recognize that proceeding with the EPPP means proceeding with. As things stand right now, the EPPP is our exam.
Yes.
It's whether to continue to proceed with the EPPP now that it's being modified in this form.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
So it's not that you're agreeing to adopt the Part 2.
No.
In the beginning, ASPPB spoke about this as Part 1 and Part 2. And all of us thought that that would require opening up the Licensure Act in order to add on. They, at some point, I think, realized the complicating factor that brought to the table and began to speak of it as Step 2 instead of Part 2.
Okay.
So I just want to be clear, and for those who are watching to be clear that the decision is either to use the EPPP, now that it would have 2 parts, or not to use the EPPP.
Right.
Thank you.
It's not we don't have an option of using the EPPP Part 1.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The other thing I should mention, Ms. Thorpe brought to my attention, is that our use of the EPPP is actually dictated in regulation. Look at Ms. Burns is really happy now that that's been clarified. What a wonk. Just so you know that it's the choice of the test is done in the regulations. We're authorized by statute to choose a licensing examination for purposes of licensing. Dr. Marcial.
Just a point of clarification. So in essence, it would be the Board of Psychology, the office that would certify students to take the test, the EPPP, the first part, and then do the same thing for the second part later on. It's not ASPPB is going to authorize students to take the test.
The eligibility will come from the Board of Psychology in California for applying for the exam, and that wouldn't change if the board proceeded with the EPPP in the two parts. That would still have to go through board staff.
Okay. And I'm just curious, I'm sure you've already discussed it, but the staffing implications for that, if you have students applying to take the test at various times of the year, I'm just assuming that there'll be, because I think you mentioned in the task force meeting that there's some 1,000 people a year or more who take the test currently?
Correct.
Okay.
It's not any different than it is now. People apply throughout the year to take
No, I'm
the
just
test.
so it would actually be double it though. I mean, at 2 times during the. The real question was who do they apply to take the first part of the test? So it's the Board of Psychology.
The Board of Psychology.
And I'm just assuming that the staffing implications are apparent.
I was just going to say, and just for clarification, that was what was laid out in the different options. One of the options was to be able to apply directly to ASPPB, and I think the consensus of the task force was that there was a feeling that the eligibility should really stick with the state of California and be determined at that level versus going through ASPPB for eligibility and applying for the exam directly.
Okay, thank you.
And currently we do look at, we currently right now approve eligibility for EPPP, and we also approve eligibility for the Law and Ethics exam, the CPLEE. So this would add some modified workload, which we would do talks with the administration about during the regulation process. So it would all get defined in there.
Okay. And any anticipated increase in fees for that? I mean, with
we
students?
don't anticipate any at this moment.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Dr. E. Bradbury.
Okay, thank you. So Cindy Yee Bradbury, I'm Director of Clinical Training at UCLA, and I represented the UC system on the task force. I'm sorry I missed the discussion yesterday, but I just wanted to ask a clarifying question about California residents who, or not California residents, graduate students who are trained in by California programs, but who then move out of state. So that, for instance, if they were to take the first part of the EPPP in California, but then move to another state, presumably they would then need to go through ASPPB in order to be able to take the second part. Is that correct?
Let me answer this as best I understand it,
right.
And that is whatever state you want to get licensed in, you're subject to their regulations. So it's going to depend entirely on how that state wants you to handle the process of applying for the license. So that doesn't really change by way of this. Some states may decide to use the ASPPB option 1. Other states may choose, as we have, to have a different procedure for that. So that's always a problem for students that are going to graduate school in one state and intending to apply for it. So I always suggest, since I teach first-year graduate students, I always suggest that they look at the licensing laws of the various jurisdictions they're thinking about to try to make a determination what they need to do to go through those hoops if they're serious about going there.
Yes, and procedurally, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm just, as an educator, as you are, very concerned about the impact that's going to have on students. Certainly those who are, going on for academic careers, for instance, won't know which states they'll be moving on to. It'll be dependent on what positions are available. That's true for even in other positions. Certainly within the VA system, for instance, they will move around presumably quite a bit. And it just strikes me that this is a huge burden that's being placed on the students where they can't anticipate what's going to happen. Now, your point is that this could be, the case regardless of where they move, but I'm not aware of many states that require, for instance, APA accreditation. And so if suddenly many states are adopting ASPPB's rule that a student needs to be from an APA accredited program, then suddenly we have a number of students that are potentially disadvantaged if they move out of California.
Just to clarify, the ASPPB option for early test taking if you attend APA accredited school is not, the eligibility on the ASPPB side is not that you have to attend an APA accredited school to take the EPPP Part 1 exam or the first portion. It is that if you attend an APA accredited school, you have the option of taking the exam early upon completion of academic coursework. So it's not dictate. That's the distinction, and it's a nuance.
Okay, thank you. That's really important.
It does get confusing, that's for sure. Are there any further public comments on the motion that's before us to adopt option number 3? Oh, we can go back to Mr. Pugliati.
I'll be very brief. I just want to simply.
Good.
Oh, there it is. Renee Pugliati, CAPIC. I just want to echo, I was on part of the task force. I definitely strongly recommend option 3 for all the reasons I've iterated before. I also want to commend the staff for already putting together the language required for option 3. I think they did an amazing job. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Erickson?
I'm trying to paraphrase or clarify what we're about to vote on. The board has not adopted.
Your microphone is not on. Thank you.
Thank you. It was on and off and now on again. The board has not yet adopted the EPPP in its aggregate form. That's pending. What we are looking at is whether we would approve option 3 if we did adopt it, and encouraging or giving staff approval authorization to move forward with the language for option 3 were it to be adopted. Am I understanding?
My understanding is we are going to move forward with a regulatory package on option 3. Should we choose not to adopt the enhanced EPPP and to go off in a different direction, we can always pull that regulatory package back. So we're just adopting a regulatory package on option 3, assuming that there's a possibility that we might. Does that make sense?
It does.
But it's just, for those of you that are not familiar with the regulatory process in state government, there are multiple layers of, I know Ms. Nelson knows this, there's multiple layers of review that we go through for various departments and agencies, and it moves on up to Office of Administrative Law, correct? So we end up with having to go through a lot of steps. So if we can get that package moving now, we have a better chance of having it completed in a timely fashion should we move forward with EPPP 2.
And I was just going to readdress Ms. Sorg's point that it's better to get something in motion now because of the lengthy process.
So if I understand correctly or remember correctly, the motion is to approve the language in option 3 for noticing and set for hearing without tacitly agreeing that the board is adopting the enhanced EPPP.
Yes.
That's correct.
Ms. Marks, will we require a second motion to delegate for non-substantive changes or no?
Sure, well, we can do it as a separate motion.
Okay.
Okay, second the first motion.
The first sentence.
It's been seconded.
Right. I can't second. Did somebody second?
I'll second.
Oh, you, Lucille, seconded. Okay. Ms. Aquavadu, I should say. So could we please call the vote?
Aquavadu?
Oh, me? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, aye.
Bernal?
Aye.
Erickson?
Aye.
Fu?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Motion passes.
I move to adopt. I move to designate non-substantive changes to staff.
Second. Is there any discussion among board members? Any public comment on that very interesting motion? Hearing none, could you go ahead and call the vote?
Akwe-Badu?
Aye.
Bernal?
Aye.
Erickson?
Aye.
Fu?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Mr. President, I would like to move to adopt the option 3 language in BMP Code Section 2940 to 2944 as presented in the item.
Do I hear a second for the motion?
Can I just get a quick clarification? I think that's the motion is to direct staff to move forward with looking for an author for the statutory changes. Is that what we're talking about, which is attachment B?
That's correct.
Is that where we are? Okay.
Yes.
Was there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Is there any board discussion? Is there any public comment? Hearing none, could we call the vote on that?
Sure. Akwe-Badu?
Yes.
Bernal?
Aye.
Erickson?
Aye.
Fu?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Why don't we take this is a convenient time to take a 5-minute break for those of you that may want to do something else for 5 minutes? I like me some gavel. So we are now going to move back to item number 13, which is approval of the board meeting minutes from May 10th to May 11th. Are there any board member comments on the minutes?
Move to adopt the minutes.
Does anybody second that motion? Okay. Okay, for discussion, does anybody have any comments they would like to make on the minutes? I'd already provided mine. Dr. Horn?
I just want to say that I have sent in some.
Me too.
I didn't know if I had to say that, but I had just sent in some minor corrections that were, or edits that were not substantive, just, you know how I am.
Move to adopt the minutes as amended by Dr. Horn.
They weren't really amended, just periods and commas and stuff.
Okay, is there any more board discussion on that topic? Is there any public comment on the minutes? Hearing none, could you please call the roll?
Sure. Akwe-Badu?
Yes.
Bernal?
Aye.
Erickson?
Aye.
Fu?
Aye.
Horn?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay. So item number 14 is the DCA executive update. And that's going to be presented by Ms. Karen Nelson, who's come here from the, I always get these titles all screwed up, Board and Bureau Relations Department of the Department of Consumer Affairs.
Good morning. Good morning, President Phillips, Vice President Bernal, Executive Officer Sorick, board members. Great to be here with you all today. Karen Nelson, Assistant Deputy Director with Board and Bureau Services with the Department of Consumer Affairs. You are very close. Thanks again for allowing me this opportunity to provide a brief update on some current activities that the department has had since we were last in front of you all. First, regarding the director's teleconference and the director's quarterly meeting on June 25th, the director hosted his first teleconference with board members, advisory committee leadership, and had over 30 participants in that call, which included board presidents, vice presidents, chairs, vice chairs, as well as some advisory committee members. During the call, DCA provided updates on the pro rata Assembly Bill 2138 and some regulatory process improvements, which, I believe, thank you for the board for participating during that call. And as you may recall, during that meeting, we did talk about some processes, including a regulatory dashboard that will help track where the packages are, as well as an additional attorney with agency that will only review DCA regulations. We hope that you found that information valuable, and with the initial success of that teleconference, we do intend to host another one before the end of the calendar year. So we do look forward to your participation at that time, and we'll make sure to send over the date as soon as that's available. Last week on August 6th, the Director's Quarterly Meeting included presentations from the Department of General Services, DCA's Equal Employment Opportunity Office, and DCA's Office of Human Resources. DGS previewed their plan for new construction that will house the Department of Consumer Affairs in 2024. The Equal Employment Opportunity Office provided a primer on implicit bias, and the Office of Human Resources shared some new improvements in HR processes specific to recruitment and adverse actions. The next Director's Quarterly Meeting is scheduled for October 29th, and once that agenda is published, I will make sure that the board receives that as well. Second update related to licensing and enforcement work groups. We do continue to hold those monthly meetings to discuss innovations in areas of licensing and enforcement, whether that's process and efficiencies or program collaboration. And this past month, the licensing work group discussed a tool for streamlining letter generation through the Quality Business Intelligence Reporting Tool, also known as QBERT. This tool is currently available to Breeze programs and will soon be available to all programs in the Department of Consumer Affairs. We'd like to thank the board for continuing to send your staff, namely Stephanie Chung and Sandra Rubio, for being present and really contributing to this dialogue. As you all know, we want to look at best practices and establishing those across our boards and our bureaus. So we do appreciate your participation in that. And lastly, the department's Future Leadership Development Program will kick off its second cohort in September. DCA received 48 applications during this cycle of recruitment, and we want to acknowledge again Ms. Thorik's participation in the steering committee and your continued support of the program. And we do hope that the board continues to encourage its emerging leaders to apply for this program in future cohorts. And that concludes the update for today. And as always, if you need anything, we are here for you. The department can be of service. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. I also wanted to mention that both Ms. Bernal and myself participated in that quarterly telephone conference with the director of the department and other key figures within the Department of Consumer Affairs. We found it incredibly useful, I think, and informative. Sometimes you don't know what to expect of a teleconference. They can devolve into kind of multiple voices.
Mm-hmm.
This was incredibly informative, I think. I really appreciated the effort that went into it.
Sure.
Thank you. I just had a quick question, too,
Sure.
on that call. We talked about they were going to do a report on like the salary structures. Is that correct?
Yes, the executive officer salary study.
Correct. Yes.
There should be an update on that at the next meeting, so we will make sure that that information is communicated to you all. Mm-hmm.
Quick question, Ms. Nelson. What did the implicit bias training entail? If you have the information on hand.
Oh, sure. So it was basically a summary stating that we all have bias, and that we should be aware of where that would manifest itself, right? So as a body which looks at licensing and or enforcement, be aware that we do have that. We also looked at it from a hiring perspective in that when you are doing recruitment, you want to make sure that your biases are checked. And given our processes of putting criteria forward and in rating how you would rate a specific applicant, it actually creates that process of eliminating that kind of bias.
And out of curiosity, were participants asked to complete the implicit bias test that I know Harvard University makes available online for free?
We actually did present that link and encouraged everyone to go ahead and participate. I have taken it as well, and it was very eye-opening. So it's a good test to take. Mm-hmm. Sure.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any handouts or links to a brief synopsis of implicit bias? What you all talked about?
We do have the slide set that we had forwarded on to the executive officers, and I'll make sure that you have it, Ms. Lork. Yeah. Yes. A printed version.
Hit print.
I'm happy to bring you a copy next time, Ms. Akwebudu.
Thank you. Is there any public comment or public questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate you coming here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Take care. Okay. The next item on the agenda is item number 15, which would be the budget report. Ms. Burns?
So we are happy to report that in the governor's budget, the board has a budget for the 18-19 year of $5,150,000, including currently the general fund loan repayment that we're rescheduled to get of $3,800,000 and an estimated fund balance of $5,159,000. You do have a hand carry on attachment A, the budget report. We had a few questions for our budget analyst, and we went over the calculations since there were a few that were missing in the original report. They are still having issues with Fiscal and getting all of the data combined into small readable categories for us with the many, many lines of expenses. So the reporting tool is still not that great, but as you can see, the reversion is now 2.4%. So we do have that reserve. Again, we do baseline budgeting, so it's how all the money shakes out at the end. I would also note that regarding the lower, it's usually around 3% or more. Sometimes things shake out towards the end of the year, depending on how much we've used contracts, and that we are currently working to gain a permanent position through the annual budget process, and we're also working with the department on potential solutions to properly align our unpredictable enforcement costs. So these are all budget items in the works. If you have any questions on any of the reports, go ahead and let me know. But other than that, we are, as always, looking good. Our budget analyst is not concerned. Mr. Marquito gave us the thumbs up, as always. We're not really a big concern for DCA's budget office, so I'll take any questions.
I don't hear any questions. Are there any questions from members of the public? Okay.
Jolynda Crow with CPA. It's been a while since we raised this question, and so I'm just very glad to hear that you're going to get the money back. And it's been a few years since we saw that as an option. And several years ago, we began to think about whether or not when the board got the money back that the state had, whatever verb you want to use, taken, whether or not there would be an opportunity to consider lowering license fees. And we've had, I think it's been several years since we even raised that. So I'll just ask if that's on the table at all. I can't quite recall what the answer was or what the discussion was before.
When we spoke about this many years ago, and I believe at the time we had anticipated the general loan repayment to come back to the board, we still are operating in a structural deficit, so we have to keep that in mind that even though we are getting a loan, we are still spending the dollars on staffing. We've had increase in complaints.
Increased licensing. So we actually have an increase in the number of licensees. It's small year over year, but it is increasing. There is a significant increase in our enforcement cases. We also have facility needs right now. We are maxed out on space, and so we will be needing some facility costs, so that will also be a part of it. And then I would also suggest because we get the general loan payment back, it goes into our fund, which is more like the savings account. It's not like you get to use it in your checking. So any sort of fee discussion would be further down the road, I think, in fixing, of course, the facility needs, enforcement costs, and making everything work out. And then, of course, trying to keep up our timelines, low licensing, processing timelines, decreasing our enforcement complaint processing timelines. Those kind of fixes first before looking at a fee decrease.
Okay, so I think that's a no.
Yeah.
But I did want to raise it.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Really quickly, just to wrap up, when we did talk about this issue a while back, I remember Dr. Gallardo had brought up whether we wanted to better the customer service and the services that are provided by the board, or did we want to consider a fee reduction? And the board discussion at that time, and I believe this was about 3 years ago or so, the discussion and the consensus around the board was that an improvement in service at the time was what the preference was of the board. So just to kind of recap where we were on that discussion many years ago.
And I'm sorry, I have one question on the budget, sorry to bring it back. On, just out of curiosity, the travel in state, I see what's budgeted and what's actually spent is significantly quite high. Is there a reason why we budget that way? Just out of curiosity. The travel in state projections current year it's 56,000, and then it says 297% spent. I'm looking at the. Are we going by the carry? The hand carry. It's on the hand carry.
Sorry, I am looking at the PDF.
That's okay.
Sorry.
No, if you go to operating expense and equipment, the last item there is travel in state.
I'm going to suggest that.
Let me show you.
Yeah.
If I may. It's kind of hard to explain when you look at bottom line budgeting, but the way the department works is you get a number at the beginning of the year, and that number gets divvied out to all these different sections. Some sections are determined based on usage and reports, and other sections are based on other things like how much money is left over and kind of what percentage they think you're going to spend. So I would assume that the 19 that you see there, the 19,000, is kind of a shakeout, and as long as we're following the bottom line budgeting, to overspend that line item is not an issue. And I bet if I look back for previous years, it would be the same kind of thing. That number probably has been the same for multiple years, and the spending has been an increase over that number for multiple years. The hard part is if we want to better align that number to our actual spending, we have to take the money from somewhere else. And so we are currently in talks with the budget office about doing a full budget realignment, but that doesn't change the number, the bottom number, the total budget amount. It just changes where the number is in the sections. So whether it'll fully fix it, I'm not aware, but that's kind of, I hope that helps.
It does, thank you. And I like where we're staying this weekend, so thank you so much. That was my main concern. I'm just kidding.
And I would suggest, we get the question a lot from the board about the red and the concern over that. And I started talks with budget to say, let's do the realignment so there's a lot less red if we can. So they're going to be looking at our expenditures, and we'll be doing a realignment. So,
but their primary concern does tend to be whether it zeroes out in the end, right?
Exactly.
Or whether we have a surplus left over, as long as we're not running into a deficit. But it would be nice if the figures more closely comported with the reality.
Exactly. And so they'll be looking at, I believe it's a past 3-year average for all of these for us. So that'll be a process as we go on.
Great. Are there any other questions on the budget report? Well, thank you, very much. Okay. We are now, we've done item number 16. So speeding ahead, we will go to item number 17, the enforcement report. Ms. Monterrubio?
Good morning. So attached to the enforcement report is the overview of enforcement activity and the legend. As Ms. Sorek stated yesterday, the enforcement unit has one vacancy, an office technician position. This position is responsible for opening and assigning complaints, referring cases to experts, and providing administrative support to the enforcement staff. Currently, existing staff has undertaken the additional workload, so hopefully we will have this position filled within the next month. Since July 1st, we have received 64 complaints, and all complaints are opened within 8 days of receipt. Complaints can be submitted several different ways, but the two most common ways are through regular mail or online using the BRIE system. The analyst assigned to the complaint will review the licensee's enforcement history before beginning their investigation. And when multiple complaints are received against a single licensee, the analyst will ascertain whether there is any pattern to past complaints, which may point to a tendency to fall short of the legal, ethical, administrative, and clinical responsibilities of that licensee. However, the mere fact that a licensee has multiple complaints in the past does not necessarily add any weight to the current complaint being reviewed. Since July 1st, the board has not issued any enforcement-related citations or referred any cases to the Office of the Attorney General. There are currently 79 probationers there are currently 79 probationers, and of those 79, 54 are currently being monitored, and 25 are in a tolled status. When an individual's probation is tolled, that means their probation is paused and no practice is permitted. There is no limit to how long an individual's probation may toll. And there are several reasons why an individual's probation may toll. For example, the probationer chooses to stop practice and take a break themselves. It is possible that a psychological evaluation is performed and it's determined that they are not safe to practice. Also, the probationer decides to leave California and reside in another state. And also, if they do not take or pass the CAPLE, they also will go into a tolled status. So regardless of an individual's probation tolling, the probationer still is required to comply with certain terms and conditions of their probation, such as submitting quarterly reports, paying cost recovery, paying restitution. Any period of time probation is tolled, it will extend the actual probation period. And again, attached to the report is the legend and the overview of enforcement activity statistics. Any questions?
I did want to comment, and I think I mentioned this to you before, but I think it's very helpful to have the explanations of all the different categories. Although you've had to explain them to us multiple times, okay. Sometimes I don't feel like I retain the information. It's very easy to look at the definition on there. So very much appreciate you including that in the report. Any other questions or comments from the board? Any questions or comments from the public? Okay. Should we move on to the next agenda item?
Okay.
Item number 18, is Enforcement Committee Report and the consideration of committee recommendations. Ms. Akwebudu?
Committee for doing such a wonderful job. Thank you, Ms. Monterrubio. The Enforcement Committee and the board staff met on June the 22nd to review the expert reviewer application. And the committee discussed several changes and approved proceeding forward with the changes. And the changes, which we understand in the attached document that we have, And this is, the committee made changes to the expert reviewer application, and we're asking that the board look at those changes, review them, and if there are any comments, please let us know, and we will take time to do that now, because we're going to ask that and for approval of the expert reviewer application. So any corrections, comments, please let us know.
I'll let the correct. Oh, I have a comment just at the end, but go ahead with corrections, please.
So first of all, this looks great. I want to say, because this, I think this has been needed for a while, and this helps clarify some stuff. So y'all just did a really great job. On point number 2, where the active practice is, I would include and or teaching and supervision or supervision.
What page are you on?
Oh, 122 of 328.
That'd be
Under
page 1 of
expert
the
reviewer
attachment.
program.
Oh, it's the second bullet point?
The
Page
second
1 of
bullet
the
point,
attachment
yeah.
for the
I'm
public.
sorry, second bullet point. Supervision is something else that people do, and that is, obviously you need to.
And so I want to clarify that you would like it and or teaching and supervision.
No, it could be, comma, teaching and or supervision, or comma, supervision.
Just
and or
insert
teaching.
supervision before
Yeah.
and or.
Huh?
Just
Yeah,
insert supervision before and or.
that. Yeah, that would be fine.
Do you understand the change?
And or supervision or teaching?
No.
Supervision
It's
and or
psychometric
teaching.
testing, comma, supervision,
Thank you.
and or teaching.
Yep.
Got it. I have the document up so we can make changes as we go. So sorry.
No, that's fine.
Oh, not at all.
That's fine.
Were there other comments?
Any other comments?
I just wanted to ask, and I think I've spoken to Ms. Burns about this. When a psychologist applies or sends a document via email that they're interested, do we respond? I only asked this because I had encouraged a psychologist friend of mine to sign up, and she, for some whatever reason, fell through the cracks, it sounds like. So I was curious as to what our process is if someone does submit a level of inquiry, and then how do we, communicate back?
So the enforcement unit has our own email address, BOP Enforcement, and if we get an email sent directly to us, we do respond within 24 hours, and then we direct them to the website so they can download the application and look at all of the requirements. If it's sent to the main email address, Sharice's team will send that over to us as well. So I apologize if your friend wasn't contacted, but absolutely we try to respond to those again within 24 hours.
Thank you.
Is there any kind of formal tracking system?
Not in the enforcement unit.
Okay. Just curious.
There's not an informal one in the exams as well, so because we do have exam SMEs and enforcement SMEs. So.
Any other questions? Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
Thank you for your report, both of you. I wanted to ask approximately what proportion of people that apply to become experts are actually approved.
I believe last year we actually sent out an email blast to all of the licensees, and we received about 175 approximately applications, and we currently have 60 experts. And again, you have to be practicing for 5 years here in California, so there were different reasons why people weren't approved. Typically, it's based on experience.
And was our goal to get to 100? I recall that from a previous board meeting for some reason.
It is, and we're going to continue to advertise and ask for experts. There'll be journal articles. We'll do another email blast probably within the next 5 to 7 months.
if I'm correct, Ms. Monrubio, or if I'm incorrect, correct me. What I do understand is that you're looking for experts in particular in some subject areas, which come up more often than others, and that sometimes the people that are applying don't necessarily match your needs.
That's correct.
Okay.
Questions, comments from the board? Yes.
I have a question related to the enforcement committee, but not related to the SME application. When should I ask that question?
Now.
Okay.
Now?
I think I had mentioned in May about the tolling for out of state, because I think it's a frequent thing that we see. And so I'm curious where that is in the process for consideration by the enforcement committee.
I'm sorry, when you say tolling for out of state, can you elaborate?
We've run into some cases where people's probation has been tolled because they're out of state. They're practicing, they're doing all the things they should do to maintain their license in another state. And at some point, if they don't intend to come back to the state, it seems like they'd almost have to relinquish their license or continue to stay on probation in California indefinitely. So I think that was the type of case we were talking about, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think there was in some cases where they had left the state as a caregiver and for an ailing parent, et cetera, and don't have the intention of returning back to California as a result of that. And I think in May, it was raised as a add for an additional item consideration, and then at that time, my understanding was that it would be referred to the enforcement committee for consideration. And so my question is, where in the calendaring or in the process is it still being considered by the enforcement committee as an item, for example, or is it something that I should be asking again at a later point?
Hopefully this can answer the question. At the last board meeting, the board considered the draft disciplinary guidelines, and this issue was addressed in the disciplinary guidelines about the number of years you could be in a tolled status, and I think that may address the concerns that you had brought up. So that process will be in the initial review phase within the next few months. So that's the goal, and hopefully that addresses the concerns that have come up.
Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Did you want to weigh in on this?
No, I was going to state what Mrs. Sork just stated, and I think the limit's going to be approximately 2 years. That way, we don't have people in a tolled status forever.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions, comments from the board? Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. And the public, do we have? Yes.
Hi, Dr. Elizabeth Winkleman, a CPA again. I just had a question about, and I'm not sure if this is the right time, so if you need to redirect me, you can, about the board's expert training workshops. There's been some concerns that have been raised by some psychologists about consistency and how are standards that are not clearly stated in the law being applied by different expert reviewers. So I'm wondering if there's any publicly available information as to what does the expert training workshop consist of?
Well, we do hold the training once a year. We just completed our last training with the assistance of the Attorney General's office, as well as enforcement staff, and as well as some veteran experts that currently work for the board.
Hi, Josh Tomplay. I'm with the Attorney General's office and the liaison for the Board of Psychology. Just a brief overview of the expert trainings. We help the Office of the Attorney General, the Health Quality Enforcement Section helps board staff put on these trainings every 2 years or so, perhaps every year. And we'll have both attorneys and experts present to the experts the training content. And so we talk about what the legal requirements are for findings of negligence, simple negligence, gross negligence, unprofessional conduct. Just a review of the legal options for taking action against unprofessional conduct. So if I can answer any questions you have about sort of the general content of the expert trainings, I can do that.
Well, maybe just briefly, if we could know if so there's nothing publicly available, like an outline of what's covered in those workshops?
No.
Okay. And how long do they last?
The training?
Yeah.
I think we had it for an afternoon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you. That answers your question. Very
Thanks.
well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Template.
Any other public comments, questions?
Just one quick clarifying statement. With the expert reviewer program, the training is not just a one-time training. It's something that is offered to the experts on a regular basis. So it's not just they're trained once and they're good to go. What's the timeline for the kind of refresher course?
Every 2 years.
Any other comments from the public? Any comments from the
I just
board?
have a question, just out of curiosity. Let's just say if there's issues related to foster youth or homelessness, which is unfortunately becoming it's a demographic that we're all dealing with. Where would that fall under, just out of curiosity, in terms of when we're looking at the specialties?
I'm
the
sorry.
areas of expertise, or if that can we, because there's some spaces there where it says other, but I don't know if people would necessarily point that out.
It could very well go under other, but are you asking that it could? Do you want it more specific?
I think I'm putting it more towards the group, thinking along those lines. And now that we have a resolution as well on the street trauma disorder and things like that, again, I'm just food for thought.
Thank you. That was one of the topics that we did discuss as we were putting this together. So we could certainly go back, and what I'm hearing that you wanted that it could be more specific than other. Okay. I can certainly take that under consideration.
One of the difficulties as a committee member is there's only so specific we can get, because at some point we're going to have a multiple page document just with the categories in which people can specify. So we tried to hit some of the big ones. I think we did a pretty good job of it, actually. I think we've expanded that list. And it was also helpful to look at what the licensing committee had done with the subject matter expert application. But I think you bring up a good point. I think under other, if people specialize in working with at-risk youth or something like that, they would probably specify that. Homelessness is an interesting idea, but there's so many demographics we could cover on here, unfortunately, because it's California.
But we will certainly take that under advisement, and thank you so much for your thinking along those lines as well. Any other comments, concerns? Have we had an opportunity to peruse the document? Okay. And the action is that we would like, may I have a motion?
I would like to move into motion that we accept the questionnaire. And you did a great job, everyone.
They did. The team did.
Thank you. Second.
Is there any discussion?
Okay. It's been moved and seconded that the expert reviewer report be approved did we want to put with, we will look at what has been called to our attention as we go back into the meeting. We will certainly take under advisement what has been noted as we go back into review. Okay, we can, excuse me.
Mr. Quabadu, I'm sorry, is the motion to approve the application and the materials as amended, or is it going back to the
No, I'm
enforcement
sorry.
committee?
Wrong thing. It's as amended, or as what has been said about that. So as amended.
Okay.
Okay.
So
That's
you were
clear.
approving the
Yeah.
package as amended?
Yes. So
Okay.
let me go back and say it again. It's been moved and seconded that the expert reviewer application will be accepted as amended. Clear?
I have a question.
Yes.
That. It seems like some things were brought up that y'all have to consider
Yes.
before it actually goes out. So I'm wondering if you want to say, here's where we are, we've got this stuff. We're going to keep going and bring it back next time. I don't know.
I'd like to make an alternative suggestion so that we can actually use the form as it's amended
Okay.
now, is that we go ahead and vote on the motion and we can put it back on the agenda of the Enforcement Committee to look at the new application
other
form, but that we can have the opportunity to use this now.
Okay,
Yeah, that sounds good.
totally fine.
Does everyone agree?
Mm-hmm.
So did I get a second on that?
Dr. Erickson.
No, the first motion, because we need to pull that second back, and then I can make the motion.
Oh, I'm sorry. So is it to accept?
Did you second it? Did you second the first motion that I made? Or did anyone second it?
Did you?
Okay, very well. And I will make...
You withdraw your imaginary second?
Then I will make the motion again. So the motion is we're asking the board to approve the expert reviewer application as submitted.
I second. As amended.
As amended? As amended. Now do I get a second?
I second.
Okay, you really second. So it has been moved and seconded, and any discussion? Then I call for the vote.
Aquabadu,
Yes.
Bernal,
Aye.
Erickson,
Aye.
Fu,
Aye.
Horn,
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
And then as a directive, which I do not think needs to be a motion at this point, is to ask the Enforcement Committee to at the next meeting, take a look at it with respect to the other comments that have been made.
Okay, so the committee, the Enforcement Committee, will look at the recommendations, take them under advisement, and bring it back to the board. Okay.
And in fairness to the Enforcement Committee and to our chair, just be aware that we have relatively full agendas in the Enforcement Committee, so it may not be the next meeting where it gets addressed. I'm not sure how much of a backlog we have on agenda. We've gotten through the disciplinary guidelines now, but there's been an enormous amount of time spent on specific activities that prevent us from moving on to the next activity. So just be aware of that. It may not be the very next meeting.
Yeah, at least.
Easy enough to say, right?
And are there any other comments? And I would just like to truly thank the enforcement team, and I like to call it a team because it truly is. Thank you, Mrs. Monterrubio, for that wonderful report that you gave. And that concludes my report. Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, we're a little ahead of time on the agenda, which is nice. So what we're going to try to do is maybe shoehorn in one or two more items. So perhaps we'll get done a little earlier than we anticipated today. So the next agenda item would be the licensing report from Ms. Chung.
Good morning, board members. Included in your materials is our licensing report. To start out, As of July 17th, our processing time frames is and as below, like on your memo. For psychologist application, the oldest date pending initial review as of July 17 was on June 12th. For psych assistant application is July 9th, and for registered psychologist applications is on June 18th. The average processing time is the average number of business days that taken our analysts to do the initial review of each type of application. So we are experiencing a little bit of a backlog due to short of staff, but we hopefully will be able to tackle that as soon as we can. And also, we have included our licensing population in Attachment A for your review, and the number of applications received for the last 12 months in Attachment B, and the exam statistic in Attachment C. If you have any questions for those attachments.
Well, did you have a question?
I do have a question.
Okay.
Thank you. I know I keep asking this, and I'm really sorry, but I'm going to ask it again.
No problem.
So, first of all, I mean, this is great. I mean, it's just really quick. And, I mean, when I look at these numbers, and I say this a million times, you know, in a month we have more people going through our process than most states even have licensed, you know, so it's just amazing to me. But I want to ask you on the oldest date pending, you know, when we're just looking at processing time frames, what kinds of things will keep an application held up longer, you know, so they're not in that average? I know we're still way ahead and a month isn't bad, but what kinds of things will...
Right. So actually, I'm going to present like a revised report to the licensing committee in October, because we see the need that to improve or make better use of our data to provide more meaningful explanation. So just to answer your question, that pending date. So when we get this get the date, is we gather all the analysts' application and then to see, okay, when is your oldest application that received and is waiting to be processed? So the main factor affecting the date is the volume of application that came in, the volume of incoming mail. We use incoming mail is like any follow-up, any deficiency that an existing applicant sending in, because we are trying to process all the applications and additional materials in the day receive order. So this is only telling part of the story. So yeah, if that answers your question.
It does, and I look forward to seeing what we get at the next licensing committee.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah,
no problem.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments from Ms. Chung from either the board or the public? Okay, well, thank you very much for that report. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And the next report is the Continuing Education and Renewals Report. Ms. McCochran.
Hi, good morning, board members. Included in this continuing education audit and renewals report is a typical stats that I include in every board meeting. I did add, per the board's request, the pass and fail rate for 2014 to 2016. And at this time, I'm happy to answer any questions you guys may have.
So, where are you at this point? You're going through the 2016, is that right?
So I just completed the 2017 audits.
Okay.
The last day for them to submit their documents to me is September 6th.
Okay.
So
2016 is completed, 15.
I'm sorry, 2016 is what I'm waiting on.
Okay. All right. That's it. So.
I wish, yeah. So 2016 only has half the year.
So one of the things that I mean, it has seemed to us for a while that the fail rate is creeping up. We don't know exactly. I mean, we see the reasons for it, but I'm wondering if maybe this is something we can look at in the next licensing committee meeting. I think that would that be the appropriate place for it in licensing? Yeah. Just to kind of take a look at our process for what happens, because you know what happens to a person when the CE hasn't been completed and what kind of process. And I know we've talked about it, but it just does seem like it's creeping up. So I'd just like to take a look at that.
Okay.
So I'm going to request that.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
Quick question. For the 2016 chart on attachment A, the number of licensees selected for audit progressively decreases towards the end of the year. Is there so I'm assuming there's a trend and reason for that, or?
So this one is only half the year. So this is from January to July.
Got it.
So it's not a complete year yet.
Understood.
Yeah.
And then to Dr. Horn's question about the creeping up, I think you're looking at attachment E. Is that what was driving that? I'm actually curious because part of the numbers looking up percentages is because your licensee population is getting smaller. So you're going from 956 in 2014 to 392. So when you have a fail rate, an absolute fail rate that's higher, it looks like the percentage is going up, right?
Right.
That's part of it too.
Yeah, I'm looking at attachment E.
Yeah. So. That was it. It was just an observation.
Any other questions or comments or observations? Hearing none, thank you very much, Ms. McCochran. I appreciate it. Oh, sorry. We weren't given an opportunity for public comment on continuing education. Does anybody have any public comment? Hearing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which would be the licensing committee report.
Okay. So I just want to say that the licensing committee is continuing to work on pathways to licensure. Remember at the last meeting we agreed to standardization of categories, and at our last meeting we agreed to a standardization of licensing categories, rolling a couple of training categories or pre-licensure categories into one thing. So and we're continuing to review the pathways. Our next licensing committee meeting is in October. And I think that we might be done with our review in pathways and be ready to bring it to the November meeting. Thank you, Ms. Chung.
No problem. So for these two items, it's actually we're keeping this as a report because we already provided an update to the board just to remind the board that licensing committee will continue to work on pathways and included the recommended changes regarding standardization, which is removing the category of a registered psychologist. So that will be reflected in pathway. And then the committee will have the goal to complete the review of pathway in the October meeting. So that's the goal for the committee regarding pathways. So, yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
And that concludes the licensing committee report. Do I move to accept the report? Ms. Marks? Ms. Sarek?
I don't know if we would need a motion because the committee hasn't met unless just as an agenda item we would need a motion.
Yeah, you can if you want move to accept it. I don't think you need to worry about any recommendations because I don't think there were any particular recommendations included in the report. So, but
So
you can
then-
just move to accept.
I don't
Never
think
mind.
I don't think the
This
report
is just for
requires
information.
Okay, well, we are really humming now. We're picking up speed. Okay, so surprise, surprise, we're going to start on the legislative update. We're obviously not going to get through the entire legislative update. The intention is to take a break around 12 for lunch. So we'll go through part of your report now, if you're amenable to doing that. And then from there on out, we'll come back and see what we have left to do on that subject.
First on the agenda for the legislative report from our Policy and Advocacy Committee is discussion and possible action on our legislative sponsored legislation for this year, primarily AB 2968. There's a hand carry for that. Do board members have that available?
What was a hand? It was an electronic.
It was
hand
electronically sent.
Right.
I'm sorry, AB 1396?
2958, is that what you're talking about?
2968.
Oh, 68. Okay. There we go.
Specifically regarding updating the brochure, sexual contact between a psychotherapist and a patient is never allowed.
The copy would have come from Jason.
Yes, so the hand carry was in the folders. There's also some in the packets that are in the back.
I think part of the confusion might be on the hand carry electronic copy. It's labeled 22A1 AB 2968.
Yes.
And then on the total aggregate packet, it's the same item number. So I think that might be the confusion. So we have the document, but I think they were just labeled the same, and that's why it's causing ruckus up here. Ruckus sorted, I think.
Okay.
Does anyone need a printed copy of the hand carry?
We're looking at the professional.
This is the bill for that.
That's in the
Yes.
hand carry.
Oh, yeah.
Would
Ms.
you like me
Burns,
to
would
go?
you want to provide an overview of this?
So AB 2968 is our sponsored legislation this year. It is to enact the changes that were desired for the professional therapy never includes sex brochure. Dr. Erickson has been testifying for us on the board's behalf at different committees. The most recent one was on June 25th, where it was heard by the Senate Business, Professions, and Economic Development Committee. Dr. Erickson represented the board wonderfully. It was a fast and at the end of the day hearing. It was out on a unanimous vote. We have not had any issues at committee. It then was passed through Senate appropriations. It has no fiscal, so it was kind of just waved on through to the floor. So, but then in late July, DCA contacted us, the Division of Legislative Affairs, with some technical assistance to provide some additional clarity on the provisions in the bill. They also approached Assemblymember Levine, and Assemblymember Levine accepted those amendments. They truly are clarifying and not very controversial in our view. Leg Council has also considered them non-substantive. So those amendments are provided to you in Attachment A. They are highlighted in yellow. Mainly that instead of saying the department shall prepare and disseminate the brochure, it names our 4 boards that are associated with the brochure, since it is our 4 boards that update the content. And if you were to call and ask for copies of this brochure, you would call our boards and we provide them. So that's kind of one of the clarifying ones. The other was a concern that even though we don't need to provide a full description of the criminal and civil remedies, that we should make consumers aware that there may be civil and criminal remedies available to them in regards to the incident. So that item has been added back in. And as you will see later on in the day in 25I, that we've added that sort of language back in to make consumers aware that although this packet is, or this brochure is about the administrative remedies and filing a complaint with the board about the therapist, that they also may still have civil and criminal remedies available to them in regards to what has happened. So that is in there. And that DCA just also wanted to make sure the requirement was that we all 4 boards put this brochure on our websites. Currently, all 4 boards already have it on their website. It's under the public, it's under consumers for some, and it's under publications for others. Obviously, for our board, this is a consumer protection measure. We're going to be having it on our website. We also, when county behavioral health calls, we also provide them with the brochures free of charge. It's part of our consumer protection mandate. So, but those are the amendments that were requested. Assemblymember Levine accepted those amendments, and I believe they went into print yesterday or the day before. So they are now in print, and the bill will continue moving along. Because there were amendments, they will have to go back to the Assembly for concurrence. We didn't have problems in the Assembly, so I don't foresee any problems at that point. And again, these are all the requirements to what goes into the brochure and when to hand it out.
And just for the benefit of our licensees and consumers, we've now sent them out for printing, but if I understand correctly, they're also downloadable from our website?
Yes.
The form, which is a very quick way for somebody to be able to get a hold of one, given the restrictions about how long you have to give the brochure to your patient or client.
So if at any point in time a licensee wanted to download the form, you can download a printable brochure and print it right off from your printer. It's the exact same verbiage that you would get if you called us and asked for copies of it. So either way is available to you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ms. Burns. Is there any, I don't think we have to vote on this, but there may be some public comment, which would be welcome.
Hi. Hi, it's Elizabeth Winkleman with CPA again. I don't have a substantive comment. So I just have a terminology point that I'd like to make about the terminology, which is, as many of you know, the American Psychological Association met earlier this month in San Francisco, and one of the items that their decision-making body, the Council of Representatives, adopted encouraged the use of the term patient instead of client in healthcare settings. So I just wanted to bring up this point for the board's consideration. As I said, it's not a substantive issue, it's a terminology issue. But I noticed that in this bill and also in other proposed bills and legislation, that the board is going from patient to client or patient or client to just client, whereas APA seems to be recommending, but not mandating. Obviously, they can't mandate it, but they're suggesting that people use the term patient more frequently in healthcare settings.
Is part of this the evolution of the nomenclature in terms of how they're referring to psychologists? Because it seems like they're referring more and more to health psychologists, which, and obviously we're healthcare providers, we're mental health care providers. I personally prefer the word patient. I had a supervisor years ago say to me that I started talking about my client. She was an older psychiatrist, quite crusty. And she looked at me and she said, "What are you doing, selling insurance?" So it's always stuck in my mind since then. But I think we have tried to move more and more in the direction of client, which is not my preference, but it seems to have been the board's preference.
So one of the things about here. One of the reasons I think we've moved to client more is because we haven't been, because in this state it's a general license, so it's not just health care. However, this brochure is only about psychotherapy. We're not saying about other things that psychologists do. So, which is, I'm thinking of our next iteration of this brochure, that we definitely might want to think about other things that psychologists do, because when a psychologist is acting in a professional capacity, sex should not be a part of that with, anyone who is that person's patient, client, organization or whatever. But, there's,
sorry.
I don't know. We're not the only group here. I think patient or client is fine. I think maybe, I don't know if it's too late to do that, but because we have groups here that they only talk about clients, and we have groups here that talk about, a couple of groups here only talk about patients, I think. But anyway, that's kind of, I think, our thought about this and movement about this and stuff. So.
Right, and I would just say that it's not elegant, but maybe in some context, sticking with patient or client might be clearly covering all those situations, but it's not elegant.
I'm hoping this clarifies, a couple things. When we went through the brochure language with the medical board and Board of Behavioral Sciences, they suggested the term client. And so that was something that they felt a comfort level with. And also, when we're going through the pathways language, there is going to be a definition section. And there's been some discussions about his and her and client versus patient. So what we want to do is to define a client is a patient, his and her means blah, blah, blah. So hopefully it'll address some of the concerns that have been brought up, and it'll be clear that it's interchangeable, that when we talk about client, we also mean the patient or the client. So hopefully that addresses the concern.
And I would just suggest that these provisions are also in the general business and profession section. So yes, these sections 337 and 728 are for Med Board, Osteopathic Board, and Board of Behavioral Sciences. So we coordinated with them on what kind of language in our proposed. That's why it went with client, so that all four boards were on board. That's probably not the way I would say that.
Okay. That's fine. And I just wanted to make it as a more general comment, as I said, because I know that in other proposed regulations and laws that the board has been considering, it's a similar issue. And I appreciate also Ms. Sorik's comment that can may be able to be addressed by the definition of each term. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for your comments and suggestions. Any more public comment? I think we can now move to the next agenda item, which would be B1A, AB 1436. This one has to do with BBS and Assemblymember Levine proposing a bill similar to our suicide training bill. Mr. Glassbeagle, are you prepared to say something about this?
Absolutely. It's an identical bill to our suicide prevention and intervention training bill that passed last year. I'd be happy to read the paragraph that I've written in the background if anybody would like. But if everyone's familiar with our bill and the requirements, it's the same concept, and this bill is currently on the Senate floor pending the third reading, and the staff recommends that the board take a support position on this bill.
Move to adopt the committee recommendation to take a support position on AB 1436.
Do we have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there board discussion? Hearing none, seeing none. Are there public comments on this motion? No public comments. I think we're ready for the question. Excuse me, Ms. Sorek?
Just a real quick clarifying. I just wanted to let the board know that the Board of Behavioral Sciences has taken a support position on this bill, and there were several comments as we were going through our own bill and the process about wouldn't this be great if this applied to other professions as well. So I just want to say that a support position would be keeping in line with where the board has been about having this requirement apply to other professions as well. That's all I just wanted to add.
Thank you. That's good. I think we're ready for the question.
Okay. Akwe-Badu?
Yes.
Bernal?
Aye.
Erickson?
Aye.
Fu?
Aye.
Horn?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Mr. Glass-Steagall, B1B, would you care to give us a brief?
Absolutely. This bill would expand the Government Claims Act to require a public entity to pay a judgment or settlement for treble damages antitrust awards against a member of a regulatory board within the Department of Consumer Affairs for an act or omission occurring within the scope of the member's official capacity as a member of the regulatory board. The bill would also specify that treble damages awarded pursuant to and for violation of specified federal laws are not punitive or exemplary damages for purposes of the Act. As of the 14th of this month, the bill was pulled by the author from hearing, so I believe the bill is not going to be moving for the remainder of the year, is my belief.
Maybe you could address the question.
So I can kind of break it down a little bit more. This bill, which that paragraph is extremely confusing, I agree. The bill is related to the North Carolina Dental Board bill, where the Supreme Court of the United States said that a board member could be liable for treble damages if it's due to antitrust. And this bill was written to protect board members in the state of California from that liability.
Could I further make a comment that it is specific to antitrust litigation and other types of litigation that might be brought against the board? We have some protection or immunity at this point. Is that correct? Or are we personally liable if a suit is brought against the board for other actions outside of antitrust?
Outside of antitrust, I believe if you're acting in your capacity as board members, that you would be indemnified for damages that do not arise from a violation of the antitrust laws.
Hi, Josh Tomplay. Just to address your question briefly, Dr. Erickson. I don't practice antitrust law, but I have defended the board in lawsuits before. And just as a general matter, individual board members are immune from damages when they act as board members, which is in their official capacity. And so that's sort of a textbook defense that's raised when as the board is sued. So that is correct.
Thank you. That's helpful and clarifying.
I think that what this is really addressing is that when board members are acting in such a way as to restrict a profession, it appears that they're operating with another agenda. And so I think there's been concern about whether we'd be held liable for, or it's been said that we could be held liable for treble damages in those situations. So I think the legislature is attempting to address that, because obviously there's not a big economic upside to being a board member. We don't want there to be a huge downside either. Nobody ever want to be a board member. But if I recall correctly, I think there is federal legislation pending now as to the question of indemnification of board members.
Our office, either the Health Quality Enforcement Section or perhaps the Attorney General's office in general, I think we do have a summary document, perhaps a page or two in length, that might be helpful that I could forward to Ms. Sorick if the board would like to take a look. It's a confusing issue. I look at it maybe once a year, so I think it's something that might be helpful for the board to take a look at.
Thank you. That's
Sure.
much appreciated.
Okay.
Good. Any other comment on this item? I guess the bill is being pulled or
Correct.
on hold at this point.
Correct. Staff originally had recommended the board take a support position, but due to the bill being pulled by the author, that is no longer necessary.
Good. Mr. Glassbeagle, would you give us an overview on B1C 2221?
For that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Ms. Burns.
So AB 2221 is for Bloom, and it's the occupational therapy bill. And existing law has the definition of occupational therapy. It talks more about the meaning of what occupational therapy includes and meaningful, organized, and self-directed actions. This bill would add provisions, and they are highlighted in yellow as the ones that we are somewhat concerned about, that occupational therapy addresses the physical, cognitive, psychosocial, sensory perception, and other aspects of performance in a variety of contexts and environments to support engagement in occupations that affect physical and mental health, well-being, and quality of life. The other sentence there is also in yellow, talking about through the engagement in everyday activities, occupational therapy promotes mental health and supports functioning in people with or at risk of experiencing a range of mental health disorders, including but not limited to psychiatric, behavioral, and substance abuse disorders. This bill was brought to our attention since occupational therapy is not normally in our realm, and we aren't normally looking at occupational therapy bills by DCA's staff, so we appreciate them bringing it to us. And when we started looking at some of the materials on the Occupational Therapy Association of California and their American Association's website, it did raise some concerns about their discussion, their advocacy materials about the talk of them being mental health providers, and some of the psychological, where is it at? Sorry. That the occupational therapy practitioners provide mental health treatment and prevention services for children, youth, the aging, and those with severe persistent mental illness with a focus on function and independence, and that unlike other professions, occupational therapy helps people function in all of their environments and addresses the physical, psychological, and cognitive aspects of their well-being through engagement in occupation. And I think the primary concern here is that the language seems to be authorizing the provision of mental health services beyond the definition of occupational therapy currently in law, and that there was some concern by our board staff, especially considering the provision that doesn't allow them to practice psychology is the reference to 2903, which is actually pretty broad. So it seems like there might be some overlap there. And occupational therapy is currently not one of the exempted other professions. So currently they are not exempted like marriage and family therapists are. And then our definition, which seems broad, seems to somewhat overlap with these definitions. So we wanted to bring it to the board's attention and see if you were also concerned about the language and the inclusion of psychosocial and the discussion of substance use disorders.
So it strikes me, Ms. Burns, this is a consumer protection issue from the point of view of the board in the sense that we have people that, to my knowledge, are not trained as mental health providers providing mental health services.
That is our concern.
Yeah. I imagine that in other realms, such as professional associations, there might be a concern about scope of practice. But certainly from a consumer protection point of view, I think this is really not a good thing.
I would agree fully with what you've just stated. On page 161, the second paragraph quotes from the American Occupational Therapy Association that occupational therapy practitioners provide mental health treatment, which is fairly explicit in terms of the intent. And it raises a number of questions about training, who provides the diagnosis for said treatment, and the list could continue. Ms. Burns, you thought when we discussed this earlier in the week that there might be some news on this. This bill is on the floor. It may be too late or not too late for us to write a letter, or could you tell us more about if we want to oppose this as written, what the options might be?
And let me give you the primer that we did give the author a heads up due to the late part of the session that we're in, that we had some concerns and we would take it to our board, but that we couldn't take a position until going to you, that we were concerned with some of the language. Right now it just had its second reading, so it is up for a vote in the Senate floor soon enough. So we could, taking a position this week, provide an opposed letter to the Senate floor, but otherwise our recourse of taking any position would go to the governor. We have expressed our concerns with the language and will send any position we take today also to DCA. DCA would include that, of course, in their recommendation to the governor in regards to signing or vetoing the bill. So we have made those concerns known, and that we would circle back once we have a board position if we have one. So it has not gone for a third reading, which just means the final vote to get the bill out of the Senate floor. So it hasn't happened yet. It just had its second reading vote the other day. They did add an amendment to make sure that marriage and family therapists, nothing in this chapter shall be construed as authorizing an occupational therapist to practice. They added marriage and family therapist in there as well. It seems to be that they think that exclusion clears up the issue, but in looking at their materials and the provision of mental health, that maybe doesn't clear it up for us quite as much as they think it does.
I just thank you for bringing this up, this second paragraph in there. And I mean, for me, as just from a consumer and healthcare community relations person, maybe it's just the way it's written, correct? And it is written to clearly convey a very descriptive service of what they do. And I was thinking more of, I know occupational therapy is helpful for people that have mental health issues as it gets them into mainstream and tries to help them from that component. But I do see how this is concerning the way it's written.
And I would suggest as staff, when we read that occupational therapy helps someone's well-being and their psychological state, we were on board with that. But in turning the coin to say that they're providing mental health services and maybe venturing into psychological treatments, that's where it began to concern us.
So the staff recommendation is oppose unless amended?
Yes.
Okay.
My
Just
apologies.
wanted to-
We are the actual position we're going for is oppose unless amended to remove psychosocial, and then the entire second sentence in the text where it talks about through engagement in everyday activities, occupational therapy promotes mental health and supports functioning in people with or at risk of experiencing a range of mental health disorders, including but not limited to psychiatric, behavioral, and substance abuse disorders, since that language did seem to imply that this was a treatment for it. So, for those disorders.
You're asking for a motion from the board?
Yes. I am asking for an oppose unless amended from the board.
I move into motion to oppose unless amended.
And I think I can, even though I'm a committee chair, I can second that. I'll second that. Perhaps I could have made the motion. I'm not sure.
You could have.
Discussion by board members? Public comment. Please, if...
Joe Lindercrow with California Psychological Association. Just to inform, and I think maybe Ms. Levy contacted you about this, I'm not sure. Our board of directors met last week, and we have taken an oppose unless amended position on this bill to add boilerplate language to the bill that says nothing in this bill is intended to affect the practice of psychology, for example. So it's very late in the session to be doing this, but that's the position we have, not to remove the same language that you're talking about, but to make it clear that this has no impact on the practice of psychology. So it's a little bit of a different twist, I guess. And
I think a lot of us were late in coming to this particular dance, so we're trying to make up for some lost ground here, but I certainly think the motion's a really good idea.
Other public comment, perhaps? Seeing none, hearing none. Unless there's further board comment, I think we're ready for the question.
Okay. Quay-Badu.
Aye.
Bernal. Aye. Erickson.
Aye.
Fu.
Aye.
Horn.
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay. For us to take our break, particularly since we have a visitor and small child infant out in the waiting room, waiting to say hi to folks. So, Dr. Kasuga is making a guest appearance in the lobby. It's a small cameo role today. So we will reconvene in an hour at 1 o'clock.